Well, is there a resistance movement inside of this White House that believe that Donald Trump is unfit to serve? Are there national security people who still believe they can control Donald Trump but are worried about it? What is the role of Stephen Miller in all of this? You know who knows better than most? Miles Taylor, who had been Donald Trump's Homeland Security Chief of Staff, who wrote famously now in 2018 an op-ed piece for the New York Times under Anonymous talking about the resistance in the first term. And he brings it all together here on Legal AF on the Court of History podcast. And here's a clip.
Welcome to the Court of History. I'm Sidney Blumenthal. I'm here with my colleague, Sean Wilentz, historian of Princeton University. The Court of History is where politics and law and journalism and the Constitution meet. It is the ultimate court. So, Sean, I want to take you back in time. We're going to enter a time machine here for a moment. It's September 5th, 2018. I don't know if you remember where you were on that day.
I don't remember where I was yesterday. So
I know what I was doing. I woke up, I went to my front porch, and I got my physical copy of the New York Times to have with my...
I think I know where you're going with this, yes.
Okay, and there was a startling op-ed in the newspaper that day. And it was written by Anonymous. And this was not Joe Klein.
I was going to say, we all assumed it was Joe right from the start, but no.
No, I knew it was not Joe Klein.
After the first sentence, you realized it was not Joe. No.
Yeah, it was a Trump administration official. We were in the first Trump term. And in other words, we were in a period of relative calm and reason compared to where we are now. Yeah. This op-ed said that this person, who was a Trump administration official, felt obligated in writing this article because his first duty is to the country. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out there are many Trump appointees who felt like he did, and that Trump had, by his account and their accounts and their experience, many misguided impulses, and that the root of the problem is the president's amorality. Anyone who works for him knows he is not moored to any discernible first principles that guide his decision-making. And it went on and said, meetings with him veer off topic and off the rails. He engages in repetitive rants, and his impulsiveness results in half-baked, ill-informed, and occasionally reckless decisions that have to be walked back. As I said, those were the good old days.
I remember all of that was happening right when Brett Kavanaugh's hearings were going on. I remember that all vividly because I was writing about that. And I was actually writing a piece for the Times, and then lo and behold, this other thing comes out, which completely blew me away. It was wonderful, but it was not good times, but they were better.
Well, it turned out that the writer of that op-ed was the chief of staff to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, a very well-placed person, and his name is Miles Taylor. He's a Republican, and he cited Republican principles. And then he came back in the news in Trump's second term. It was not of his own doing. He had published a book called A Warning based on his op-ed, and another book, but he was working away in private life. He was active in politics. He's doing all sorts of things. Interested in technology and AI. And then on April 9th, 2025, this year, 2 months ago, Trump issued an executive order against him as a person. This is very much in the style of Stalin, of no man, no problem. And it cited not only Miles Taylor, but also Christopher Krebs, who had been head of cybersecurity. And Krebs's offense, according to the executive order naming him, was that he did not believe that the election of 2020 was stolen and that it was a free and fair election, given his role in the government as reporting factually. So he was being punished with an executive order. The order against Miles Taylor and Krebs was extraordinary and is extraordinary because it characterizes them as treasonous and possibly violating the Espionage Act and therefore ineligible for national secrets. And it's an attempt to erase them as people, to destroy their business, to destroy them personally, to proscribe them. This is not, no, as far as I can recall, there's never been a presidential executive order issued against American citizens.
Yeah.
I don't know what you make of all this, Sean. It seems like many things unprecedented in history.
Oh, it's completely unprecedented, but it's there are many things that are going on with these executive orders, but one of them is literally almost mafia-like. You just said Stalin. I think of more of Joe Bananas or something like that. John Gotti. It's a rub out. It's an attempt to do a rub out by executive order, and that's part of it. It's vengeance. It's retribution, but it's in the style of a rub out.
Yeah. Well, as it happens, we have Miles Taylor here. And he can tell us all about this and a lot of other things, given his expertise in national security, Homeland Security. And I want to introduce Miles Taylor. He's a #1 New York Times bestselling author. He obviously held top national security posts. He was chief of staff at DHS. And he was also the head of advanced technology and security strategy at Google. And before that, he worked at the House of Representatives on the Homeland Security Committee, the Appropriations Committee, worked in the Speaker's office as a Republican. And he started his career in the George W. Bush administration at the White House in DHS. So he has an extraordinary background. And Miles, welcome to the Court of History. And I want to begin by asking you, how do you compare and contrast what you observed and wrote about in the first term with what you're seeing now in the second?
Well, first of all, gents, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. The one thing that Sid left out was the morning he woke up and found out that I unmasked myself. And I'm sure he, like many others, was disappointed that it was this guy, Miles Taylor, no one had heard about. And I say that only half facetiously because so many people, myself included, had wished it was a different name under that byline of that anonymous piece, because most of the president's cabinet members at the time felt the same way I did. And as one of their underlings, I expected any of them but me to go out there and say these things to the American people that so clearly needed to be said. But as the administration went on, it dawned on me that none of these graybeards in Washington, in that administration, or in the party were going to do it. And I grew very frustrated. And, internally, I was trying to foment something that would have been sort of a midnight self-massacre inside the Trump administration. I mean, we were trying to get a group of those like-minded cabinet members to resign en masse to prove a point. And it almost happened before the 2018 midterms. And that summer, there was kind of not some sort of group meeting and a decision, but it was clear that those cabinet members all sort of decided we should just hang on and see if we can make this thing better. And
these are the adults in the room, right?
These are the adults in the room.
Yeah.
Well, I helped.
You were aware of their feelings about Trump.
For sure. Was in a number of conversations with these folks about how to keep the administration and the country from going off the rails. And I had hoped that, there was going to be this big declaration of opposition. Now, fast forward in time, that sort of happened in dribs and drabs. If today you go back and you look at all the Trump cabinet members that have come out and opposed him, John Kelly and Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and Dan Coates, who was his director of national intelligence, and all these folks, imagine how much more impactful that would have been if they had all come out in the same time in the middle of the Trump administration and said, this is not sustainable, this guy is not well. And that didn't happen. And unfortunately, they all took their own time. And I'm glad that a lot of them did come forward. But that frustration, in part, caused me to go write the opinion piece. But when I unmasked myself again, like I said, a lot of folks had hoped, it was them. A lot of folks had hoped Mike Pence was on the byline, but he wasn't. Now, you asked a question, Sid, about the difference between this second Trump administration and the first one. And I think that's the answer to the question, is those people, leaders of conscience, seasoned national security leaders who had believed in this axis of adults thesis, are no longer there. And a lot of the decisions that at the time we had told the president were at best unethical and at worst unconstitutional are now getting implemented. I mean, a lot of these, for instance, the deployments of the military in California, this is something regularly Trump wanted to do when in the first term, and would personally tell us he wanted to go deploy troops or invoke the Insurrection Act. And repeatedly, we talked the president out of it, and often because we didn't feel like the way he wanted to do it was lawful, including the ways he wanted to deploy the Insurrection Act. You can love or hate people who served in the first Trump administration, but this second administration is proof that there were a lot of decisions that were prevented by that so-called axis of adults that now are no longer being stopped. And so I think that is singularly the biggest difference is Trump is no longer surrounded by some people of conscience. The Oval Office has become an echo chamber, and that echo is quite authoritarian in its acoustics.
Are you in touch with people on the inside now? And do you have a feeling of what they're thinking and whether any of them feel the way that the group of officials in the first term who wanted to stop Trump feel now? Are they appalled? Are they upset? Are they scared? Are they intimidated? What's the feeling that you get?
Well, I hesitate to be too specific because they've already intentionally fired people from the executive branch who are known associates of mine just because they know me. So just a few weeks ago, they fired a senior trade official because the White House found a photograph of him at my wedding. And then they went further and humiliated him by putting that story in the Washington Post. Guy who was at Anonymous's wedding, kicked out of the administration. So they're doing that. But, look, if I was sitting with Donald Trump right now, I would say, I have friends in your White House. And some of them are, laying very, very low, but share some of the same concerns that I had during the first Trump administration, that the man is still the same man, but worse and emboldened, still deeply impulsive, but impulsive without checks and balances around him. And I don't just mean institutional. I mean, the people around him aren't trying to talk him out of doing bad things. If anything, they are demonstrating fealty at every turn to the leader. And that's resulting in a lot of bad decisions getting made. Now, most of the folks I know are on, of course, the national security side of the house. And, some of them still think that they can keep their hand on the wheel. And I would prefer some of those people in the posts I'm thinking about than others who might replace them. But I think people of conscience in this administration know that they are an endangered species.
I just want to know, though, about the ideological character of all this. I mean, it's one thing to be, trying to be the adult in the room. My sense is that there are not only no longer any adults, but there are lots of people there who actually have their own agenda, which is very, very powerful, very much aligned with the president's, and that's driving it as well. You say what you want about the current, head of Homeland Security, whatever you might think of her, but there are others around that White House that are much more dangerous, much more ideologically driven, much more authoritarian in their instincts than anybody that was there, or most of the people that were there.
Well, Stephen Miller was there in the first term, but now he's really in charge.
But he has much more power, and he's much more, and there are more people like him. Put it that way.
What do you hear about what people think on the inside about Miller's power?
It's it's almost absolute. He would never say that. Stephen is very, very careful to always be entirely deferential to the president. But I can tell you, I remember when Stephen convinced the president at one point, I think it was 2018, he was growing really, really frustrated with basically the slow walking that was happening over at the Department of Homeland Security when it came to some of the president's more outlandish ideas. He wanted to do a lot of things that just our lawyers knew would so clearly break the law. And, not only did we not want that for the country, but people like me didn't want to go to prison because of it, right? He had really dangerous notions, and Stephen was growing frustrated, and he convinced the president effectively at the time to put him in charge of a broader Homeland Security policy for the administration. It wasn't some public announcement, but he'd gone to the president and said, look, I'm tired of this, basically give me the authority to make some of these decisions over at DHS and essentially override the department. And he called me to tell me this. I remember where I was. I was driving on Capitol Hill, and it was the words he used that stuck with me. He said, think of this as my coronation. That's what he called it. He called it his coronation, that he'd gotten the president to empower him to take on these new duties. And
not since Prince emerged in Minneapolis as the prince like this.
That's
There's
right.
There's a lot of royalist thinking, it seems to me, automatic royalist thinking in those.
There is, though, and that was, I think, the most revealing thing that I ever heard come out of his mouth. And Stephen rarely, you really rarely get these unguarded moments with them. He's extremely guarded, and that was sort of an unguarded moment from him, but I think illustrative of not just where his head is at, but also how this administration, like you said, thinks of governance is not in terms of democracy and checks and balances, but how can you consolidate total rule? And so Stephen certainly has that inside this administration. He's got much more authority than he had before, and you are seeing what that looks like if left unchecked. All of the, right up into these military deployments, that is, that's got Stephen Miller's fingerprints all over it.
So, Kristi Noem, who is the chief bureaucrat, the secretary of DHS, doesn't act like an actual cabinet secretary. And I say that besides her cosplay and, various numerous costume changes. She's under the thumb of Stephen Miller. And I wonder what people on the inside say about that and how they feel about what's going on there.
I think there's a recognition in the department that the current secretary is not a policy heavyweight. And so the only place that she sort of has any run room.
You're still so diplomatic and euphemistic.
I was going to say, not a heavyweight. No, that's
not a heavyweight.
But the result is, what can you do if you don't have a command enough of the issues to run that department, or at least to be able to stand up to the White House and make decisions? Well, all you can do is PR. And I think that's the role she's settled into, is essentially the president's Homeland Security PR person. And it's not unreasonable or outlandish to say that Stephen Miller is running the Department of Homeland Security. I very much believe it. And I know that day to day, that tactically, that is what's happening. And I used to be on the receiving end of those phone calls. Is Stephen would call you 20 times a day, without exaggeration, if that's what he needed to do, to say, do this, do that, sign this order, draft this order, spin up this policy coordination committee. He would micromanage the department. And I suspect he's doing that with a lot less resistance in this administration. But that started very early on. I can remember John Kelly coming in during one of the first weeks into a morning staff meeting. There was like a group of 6 of us, that met every morning with him and started the day and outlined, the full day and what was to come. And one of those mornings he came in hot as a hornet and he banged his fist on the table. He said, listen, if you get a phone call from this White House, whether it's Stephen Miller or someone else, and they direct you to do something, tell them to pound sand and call me. He said, I'm the one that the Senate confirmed, the president appointed and the Senate confirmed to run this department, and decisions will come through me. And, don't take those phone calls. But I don't think that that's happening anymore. I think the phone calls are coming in all across DHS. And it's kind of like what the rumor used to be about Dick Cheney, which was part true. It was a little bit exaggerated, but Cheney was very effective because he would reach down into the bureaucracy, into these offices that a lot of high-level policymakers weren't familiar with, to pull the levers, to get things to happen, because he was smart, he was savvy, he'd been in Washington for decades, he knew how to get those things done. Stephen is very similar and, a little bit more focused just on DHS, but he'll call in all the way down to a GS-12, right, a sort of a mid-level government bureaucrat appointee, and direct them to do something. And, that's the only call they've ever gotten from the White House directly. And they're not going to say no to Stephen Miller, the president's right-hand man. And so things just happen. And so, this White House is very, very actively micromanaging DHS. Why is that bad for the American people? Because you lose all of those checks in the process of people who know better, people who have experience, lawyers, and all of a sudden things you never thought would come to fruition are announced on CNN.
But even beyond the DHS, I mean, remember, Sid, you wrote about this during the Signal Gate episode, where they were talking about basically deployment of American troops. Pete Hegseth is on the call, and it turns out someone else is on the call as well. But nevertheless, the final decision that was being made seemed to be being made by Stephen Miller. I mean, he seemed to be acting president on foreign policy now, and quite apart from DHS. I mean, does his power, from the people that you speak to, of what you know about it, does his power extend beyond that? Is he in effect something of a co-president?
It might be a bridge too far, and Stephen would never promote that notion. He knows all of his authority is derived from the president, and again, I think he's probably the only person. I mean this genuinely. The only person I ever engaged with at the White House that never showed daylight with the president. There was never a private meeting where Stephen said, "This fucking guy has no idea what he's doing." But right. Almost everyone else I engaged with, the biggest names to the no names, would have that conversation in private. Total frustration with the president, recognition of who he really was. But Stephen in private wouldn't even show you that he thought the president was what everyone knows him to be. That said, he exerts enormous authority because he can toggle from being, policy mastermind into mega MAGA mouthpiece. And Trump loves that. He's the translation layer that Trump needs. And Trump does need a translation layer because he's in this very foreign space still inside government that's got all of these acronyms and things he doesn't understand and laws and policies and regulations. Yeah. But he wants very simplistic things done, whether they're lawful or not. And he needs someone that is able to toggle between comms guy and policy guy to be that translation layer. And Stephen fits that mold perfectly.
And people on the inside still relate information to you about the dynamics in there.
Yes, and it's a very, very different administration than it was then. I mean, there are far fewer people willing to stand up internally, and a great deal of fear. This is a much more buttoned up administration because, as a lot of folks like me warned, it's mostly loyalists. And those loyalists, while they swore an oath to the Constitution on their first day, most are operating in a manner in which the guy at the top is who they swore the oath to. And that has, very insidious effects on the execution of public policy, but it also means that internally there's a very low degree of social trust. In other words, folks in this administration don't think they can go to cocktail hour with someone and complain about the president without fear of not only being fired, but having their life completely upended, because they've seen what's happened to ex-officials like me, that the president with a stroke of a pen can order a federal investigation into you and upend your life completely.
I mean, maybe that's the point of what you're doing. And what he did, in fact, was to tell everybody there now, see what happens? You're a warning signal.
And he sent officials out to say that. There were White House officials in the wake of the executive order against me who said, their words, not mine, this is meant to send a message. They were very blunt about that. And I think that message has been received. People are very fearful. And I will say, while I still have folks I talk to in the administration very discreetly, that there are a number of folks who, after that order, went completely dark. I mean, longtime friends that I've known for a very long time who, stop talking to me on iMessage, stop talking to me on Signal, because they were way too worried. And they have reason to be. Like I said, they're ferreting people out in the administration, who've simply associated with me socially in the past. That's the level of sort of Stalin-esque, Stasi-esque behavior happening inside this second administration.
Welcome back. Sidney Blumenthal, Sean Wilentz, our resident historians. They bring on people that you need to hear from and be briefed by, like Miles Taylor. Miles Taylor, who's been viciously attacked by MAGA. Against great personal sacrifice, he comes out and talks to our audience about that resistance movement inside the White House. If you like that kind of work, then you've come to the right place. We sit at the intersection of law and politics on Legal AF, and we do it like no other. Join us, hit the subscribe button. That's your vote. Take a receipt for helping support our pro-democracy YouTube channel. So until our next report on Court of History and Legal AF, I'm Michael Popak. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.